Hello, this is Raf Alvarado and welcome to Exploratory Text Analytics. In this video we're going to look at sentiment analysis. So far we've been focused on methods that surface cognitive content in this class. The methods of topic modeling and word embedding, even principal component analysis have looked at what we will call the locutionary dimension of discourse following Ricoeur, who is basically just echoing speech act theory. But we know from our understanding of culture that culture, which we're presuming to be embedded in text or contained in text, and you remember this class is based on this principle that we're kind of excavating texts for their cultural content. It consists of more than just cognitive content. It consists of a combination of ethos and worldview. And just a quick review. What we mean by worldview are things like cognitive categories. Sometimes they're called world hypotheses, ontologies. These are the ideas that people have that they carry around, which are generally shared within a society about how the world works, and the kinds of things that exist in the world. They're not always, evenly shared and so forth, but they are things that you can imagine are dependent on the time and place where one lives. Ethos, on the other hand, refers more to the dimension of culture that relates to emotion, the values that people have, their norms, their sentiments toward things, the things that they like or don't like, relates to taste. Sometimes they're called emotional configurations and so forth. And this dimension of culture is related to the illocutionary dimension of discourse. And remember, illocution refers to the subjective intent behind a speech act, why someone makes a speech act, and you can see how that's related to emotion. So speech acts, illocutionary qualities of speech act refer to whether something is a request or a plea or something like that. So in this context, what is sentiment analysis? Well, to quote Pang and Lee, which I've not asked you to read, but it's sort of a standard text in the field, sentiment analysis is the computational treatment of opinion, sentiment, and subjectivity in a text. You can see from this definition that the word sentiment is used loosely to cover things like values, opinions, emotions, etc., the things that I described as belonging to ethos. So what I'd like to do is just be a little more precise relative to the framework that we're using in this course and to describe sentiments as expressive illocutions. And that comes from the philosopher John Searle. I'm not going to ask you to read anything by him, but he classifies different kinds of illocutions, and one kind is expressive, and that refers to the sort of the emotional valence behind a speaker's intent in a speech act. And this sort of thing is evident in word choice and intonation and that sort of thing. Just as a quick side note, realize that in sentiment analysis, the concern, almost by necessity, is that we're trying to describe the emotional valence or quality of the text itself. In other words, we really can't, using the methods that we have, get to the level of a speaker's intent, nor can we get to the, real effect of a text. We can just focus on what a text actually contains, with the assumption that this is related to the speaker's intent. So just keep that as in mind when we go forward. So what is sentiment analysis? It's closely related to emotion analysis and intent analysis, as I just distinguished. There are fields, like if you go looking around and searching for sentiment analysis and looking for different ways of pursuing it, different methods, you're going to come across these terms: emotion analysis, intent analysis, where the purpose is a little more specific. So in emotion analysis, you're actually trying to find not just sentiment in a text, whether a text is positive or negative, and we'll get into that in a second, but what kinds of emotions are expressed in a text. Intent analysis is an effort to get at why people are communicating in the first place. Are they marketing? Are they fishing? Are they being fraudulent? Are they being sincere? That sort of thing. We're not going to get into intent analysis at all. We are going to look at some emotion analysis. Finally, sentiment analysis is part of a much older branch of text analysis called content analysis. This is a method that's developed in the 50s, basically, where you basically find words in text and associate them with certain topics, and then you statistically describe the distribution of those terms and thereby those topics in a text. It's a very, in a way, it's a crude form of topic modeling or other things that we're doing by other methods these days. But sentiment analysis, which uses some of the same methods as this older approach, and we're going to go into one of them, the general inquiry system, is probably this, you can think of it as a survivor of this older set of methods called content analysis. So some example uses of sentiment analysis are, a very common one is investigating brand sentiment for marketing or anything else actually. Do people like our product or do people like our candidate? Another use is to gauge the tone or mood of a population. What's the national consciousness right now? Are people happy or sad? What's the sentiment on the stock market? What is the how happy is our society geographically? And actually, we're going to look at that essay by Mitchell, Geography of Happiness. Another very common, very successful use is opinion mining. And this is where you essentially combine some means of getting at the content of a text. It could be topic modeling. You combine that with sentiment analysis, and you can arrive at, sentiments toward things, which are essentially opinions. Many argue that it's better than polling because polling has two limitations. One, first of which is that the number of people you can poll is always limited. And the second is that polling is always self-reporting, and there was always a bias in that. Humans are notoriously bad at representing themselves. They're always going to, at some level, wonder why they're being asked a question. They'll inflect their answer in a certain way. Whereas opinion mining, when you're just mining social media, for example, the presumption is that people are being more sincere. They're not necessarily realizing that they're contributing to an opinion mining operation, for example. And so there's some work that demonstrates the utility of this approach. Another use is to study of narrative patterns, which we're going to look at a little in this module and in another module coming up. Sentiment patterns within text over narrative time. So you can just look at the movement of a certain sentiment like joy or something, or just polarity over time, and you can see the peaks and the valleys of a story, and that presumably relates to the plot of the story. So here's an example of looking at not a story but of history through a newspaper, through newspapers. This is from an article that I'm going to ask you to read, Lee Charoux's article on, it's called Culturomics 2.0, where he does sentiment analysis of newspapers relative to nation states. And here he's showing the rise and fall of sentiment associated with Egypt in journalism. And he wants to talk about this as a way of possibly predicting the Arab Spring. Regardless of the status of that claim of prediction, it's very interesting to see these newspapers as what I like to call social censors, showing you the rise and fall of collective sentiment toward an object such as Egypt. Remember, in our other module on topic modeling, DiMaggio's essay on funding of the arts gives a really interesting, useful understanding of what newspapers are and how they represent elite views and communicate those to people. And so when we're talking about a social censor here, we're talking about the social sensing of of what reporters report on, which is oftentimes the opinions and views of elites. It could be the reporters themselves projecting their opinions, or it could be the reporter's interpretation of collective human behavior. In any case, you have a really interesting outcome here of what I'm going to call social sensing. Here you have an example of the use of sentiments to describe the distribution of sentiment over space, and to arrive at what Mitchell and Frank call the geography of happiness. This is another essay I'm going to ask you to read. And here's a visualization where you have, it's using Twitter, which is not long-form text, which is, so it's a little bit of a deviation from what we look at normally in this class. But it shows you something interesting. You can see, where presumably people are happier. You see that Manhattan is full of red, which is associated with happiness. Obviously, if you're in downtown Manhattan, you're happy, and people over in New Jersey look less happy, actually. Anyway, so to repeat, the the idea here, text can be viewed as sensors, transducers, if you will, of cultural and social information, and sentiment is a really, really important kind of information, a really, what do I want to say here, very effective kind of information that is transmitted through text. It seems pretty easy to pick up, although we're going to see that what sentiment analyses detect is oftentimes hard to interpret. It's not as straightforward as it seems. Like when you say a text is happy, it's not always clear that it really is happy. It's clear that something is being detected, but it's not always clear that it's exactly what the sentiment analysis says it is. There are all kinds of mitigating factors, word use, for example, and we're going to look at that in a second. Okay, so how is sentiment represented? So typical representations of sentiment. The most basic way sentiment is represented is as polarity or valence, although valence is sometimes used for magnitude as well. But we'll just call it polarity. And that is, a text will have a positive or negative polarity. Between -1 and 1, oftentimes it can be a different scale. Actually, what we're referring to here when we say -1 and 1, that typically refers to the token within a text, and then we apply some mathematical procedure to sum that up to get the aggregate polarity of a text. It's important to understand also that some words may be neutral, many words are neutral, and sometimes neutrality is taken as a proxy for objectivity. And so there's another dimension to this, which is that a text can be described as more subjective and less subjective, depending on how much polarity it has. If you look at just the polarity of a text independent of its positivity or negativity, just its magnitude, you can get a sense of, well, this text is very subjective because it's got a lot of sentiment terms in it, versus a text that has few sentiment terms and lots of neutral terms. So sentiment may also have magnitude. So instead of using a numeric value like a binary of plus or minus 1 or 0, that's not binary, but it's roughly categorical. You apply floating numbers, or maybe you apply a scale of 1 through 5 positive, 1 through 5 negative. That gives you a sense of how positive or negative a particular token is, and then in the aggregate a text is. Another way of representing sentiment is to break it out or expand it into categories of emotions. And there are different theories of how many emotions there are. It's a surprisingly unsettled field within psychology. There are, a surprising lack of consensus, from what I understand, on precisely how many emotions there are. But a lot of people seem to have settled on Plutchik's wheel of emotions. So Plutchik is a psychologist who came up with this. I'm got to get back to you on exactly when. But this is a wheel that is often used, and typically within this this diagram, you'll see that there are concentric circles. It's the second concentric circle going outward that is typically used when people are trying to go beyond just describing the sentiment of a text and describing which emotions are in a text. And some of the lexicons we're going to use in this module, in fact, do use these terms that you can see of joy, trust, fear, surprise, sadness, disgust, anger, and anticipation. So how do you measure sentiment in a text? So the most basic way, and this is the method that goes back to content analysis, this sort of archaic, almost dinosaur of an approach, is where you have a dictionary of terms. Basically, you have a subset of your vocabulary that you have associated with emotional or sentiment values. So the word happy, for example, is going to have positive polarity, and the word sad may have negative polarity. But there are lots and lots of terms that you can put into this dictionary, some of which, you'd be surprised, of how they're assigned a value. But in any case, what you have is a subset of the total vocabulary, each term of which gets associated with a valence or a polarity, and then you just map those terms to a bag of words, like a particular container, like a paragraph, and see how many happy words there are, how many sad words there are, and you come up with some aggregate result. Another approach is machine learning. This is where you get a whole bunch of text, and it could be text of a granular nature. It could even be sentences, and you get them classified one way or another. Through human annotation, Mechanical Turk, for example, and then you basically generate a classifier to predict positive and negative text, and you can even from there, reverse engineer a language model for each polarity. And another approach is we'll call rules-based, using heuristics. Sometimes this is called a mixed approach. And one example here is Vader, and that's where you use a combination of things. You can use a dictionary of terms, or maybe some crowdsourcing. Vader is interesting because it focuses on the sentence level, and it also takes into consideration certain heuristics such as punctuation. Like if you use, it even counts how many exclamation points you use. It's really focused on social media, where people do kind of riff on things that you won't find typically in, a more standard text like a novel or a newspaper article. People using emojis, using punctuation in non-standard ways. Those things all have an effect on, the interpretation of a text as being, positive or negative sentiment. Vader's pretty interesting. We're going to see it applied to a set of novels actually in our code walkthrough. So what is a lexicon, real quick? So a lexicon is a kind of dictionary in which words are glossed as features. Features may include ontological categories and numeric properties, but in our data model, a lexicon is an extension of the vocabulary table. And so basically what I'm trying to say here is that, you have a dictionary of terms, I mentioned this earlier, a subset of your vocabulary, and it may have a number of features associated with it, one of which is what is its polarity. Another may be, what is its, does it represent happiness, plus or 0 or 1? Does it represent sadness, 0 or 1? It can represent, and you can have lots of different features associated with words for the different kinds of content analysis you want to do. And we're going to look at a couple of these in a second. But the point I want to make here really is just simply that a lexicon is a subset of your vocabulary. And in our data model, what you're going to do is just simply bind it to your vocabulary table, and then that can then propagate to your tokens table, and then you can do all your analytics that way. You can also, of course, just use sentiment analysis packages that are available. NLTK has something. There's something called TextBlob out there, but we're going to look at this from scratch because it's such a simple set of methods. So some examples of sentiment lexicons that are out there, and there are many. I'm just pointing out a few of these. There's one of them that's well known called Luke. I think this comes from the late 1990s. That was developed within an academic context. It's often used. It's very well respected. There's something called the General Inquirer, and this is, we're going to look at an article that uses this, and this goes back to the 60s, and it's been developing over time. And this is an interesting lexicon because it's got lots of different features other than just simply, sentiment. And then there's an NRC word emotion association lexicon, also known as Emolex, that we're going to look at. This was developed by Saif Mohammed in Canada, University of Toronto. And it's actually a really neat lexicon because it doesn't just have English, it's got lots of different languages, and it aligns all of these vocabulary terms to polarity, but also to emotions. And then there are some that, here are a couple of examples: ANU, CentiWordNet, CenticNet. We're not going to look at these. And these use float values as opposed to categorical uses of numbers like -1, 0, and +1, which the ones above use. So to repeat, I think I've mentioned this a little bit, but the general method of how you apply a lexicon to generate an estimate of the sentiment of a text is you begin with the bag of words model of the corpus. You convert your document term matrix into a bag of words. And then for each word in that bag of words, you map it onto the lexicon that you have. You can do this by creating an inner join between your tokens table or your bag of words table and your vocabulary. And then the polarity of the vocabulary terms is inherited by the token table. And then you can just apply some aggregate function to each bag to generate the outcome. I have here summing, majority voting, averaging, thresholding, and counting. We're going to use averaging, or taking the mean, which actually turns out to be very close to just taking the sum. So basically you count up all the positives, count up all the negatives, and you get your sum, or you average them out within a document, and that gives you then your total. You can normalize that if you want, but typically you don't always have to do that. There are other enhanced methods which use other features and heuristics that are a little more fancy than what we're talking about here. As I mentioned earlier, Vader is one of these, works at the sentence level and uses some special sauce to get at some of its outcomes. And we're actually going to import a Vader library in our code walkthrough and show you how it works looking at a particular novel.